Here's something that bothered scientists for years. For 200,000 years, humans who looked exactly like us walked around on this planet. Same brains, same bodies. And supposedly, for most of that time, they didn't do much interesting. They didn't have art, they didn't have symbols, there was nothing innovative. Then around 50,000 years ago, something miraculous happened, or that's what we've been told. Suddenly, humans exploded with creativity. Cave paintings showed up, complex tools appeared, and scientists dubbed these innovations the Great Leap Forward and the Human Revolution. It's a topic that has been taught in textbooks for decades, except there's this massive problem. The story is wrong. Flat out wrong. And why it's wrong matters because it tells us something uncomfortable about how science works and who decides what the human story is. It will show us a fundamental bias that shaped how we understand human history, where archaeologists have looked and whose ancestors they thought was worth studying. If you're ready, be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you do not miss more videos like this. Now to the story proper. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago. The early humans looked like us but supposedly didn't think like us. They made basic stone tools but nothing impressive. No art, no jewelry, no symbolic thinking. They were anatomically modern but behaviorally primitive. Then about 50,000 years ago, cave paintings appeared in Europe. Carved figurines, elaborate burials, and bone flutes. There was an explosion of innovation from nowhere. Scientists figured something fundamental must have shifted in the brain during this period, probably through cognitive mutations to give us language or abstract thinking. There was this gene FOXP2 researchers got excited about during the study. They called it the language gene and thought perhaps that was the switch that got flipped 50,000 years ago. The only problem is when scientists analyzed Neanderthal DNA, they saw that Neanderthals had the same version of the gene that we do. So did denisovans, which means there was no miracle mutation. So that brought the bigger issue to light. Was this whole framework about human evolution built on an assumption nobody simply questioned for decades? Does Europe represent the full story of human development because that's where most early archaeology happened? Where people found famous painted caves like Lascaux and Chauvet, where evidence seemed to show sudden modern behavior? The answer to these questions lies in what nobody wants to say. The Great Leap Forward wasn't real. I mean, think about it. The human revolution was simply an artifact of where we looked, a story from European data about European sites with European populations. Then that European story became humanity's story. When you look at evidence from Africa, the story of the human revolution takes a completely different turn. For instance, at Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found a paint-making workshop dating back to 100,000 years ago. They found proof of humans grinding ochre pigments, mixing them with bone marrow and charcoal, and storing it in abalone shells for later use. That's complex planning requiring abstract thinking about future needs. At the same site, geometric patterns were found engraved on ochre going back 77,000 years. Deliberate repeating designs suggesting symbolic thinking, maybe even precursors to notation or writing at that time. Shell beads with drilled holes for stringing have turned up at multiple African sites dating 100,000 years and older. Those were personal ornaments serving no survival function, ornaments with a social and symbolic meaning, revealing complex social structures we never thought existed at the time, a time where status and identity should not have mattered. How then can we call the European story human history? So you might want to ask, why did it take forever for this evidence to actually shift what people believed about human origins? Well, part of it is that Africa doesn't preserve organic materials the way European limestone caves do. That's real, and it's a genuine issue. Part of it also is that archaeological funding and attention got concentrated in Europe for most of the history of the discipline. Then there's another part that people don't always want to talk about directly, which is that there still is a serious resistance from people to accept that the most important developments in human behavior happened in Africa with African populations rather than in Europe with European populations. We call it the Eurocentric bias at its finest. It's not a matter of geography or where people happened to dig first because that's where they lived. It is the idea that modern behavior originated in Europe, and so Europe must be the foundation of human progress and civilization. It is a narrative that was built over time, turned into basic assumptions about humanity's story, and a narrative that worked really well because of its roots in colonialism and scientific racism. After all, at the time scientists began their investigations, prejudices already existed about which human populations were truly advanced and which ones were primitive or backward. So the bias was always going to be there from the jump, no surprises. What matters now is humanity confronting some really uncomfortable truths about how science that's supposed to be objective has actually been shaped by racist ideas about human development and human worth. Still, even if all of humanity accepts that behavioral modernity showed up earlier than we thought, there's still something puzzling. For one, the archaeological record surrounding human development is full of gaps where behaviors and innovations appear, stick around, then disappear for thousands of years, and then come back. The explanation that makes the most sense for it involves demographics and social networks. Research shows that maintaining cultural innovations needs a certain population size and connectivity between groups. This means that when populations crash or groups get isolated, they lose skills and technologies, not because people get less smart, but because small groups just can't maintain complex cultural knowledge across generations. I mean, if you think about it, take 100 modern humans and stick them on an island with zero outside contact. Within a few generations, they'd lose the ability to manufacture computers, perform advanced medicine, maybe even make glass or refine metals. It's not because they would have gotten dumber, but because you need larger networks of specialists sharing information to maintain that knowledge. That's how we know that behavioral modernity isn't a switch that stays on. It's fragile, emerging under certain conditions and disappearing when those conditions change. The sudden modernity humanity came into 50,000 years ago might just reflect when European populations grew large and connected enough to maintain innovations instead of losing them repeatedly. So where does that leave the Great Leap Forward? What's left of this idea that something special happened 50,000 years ago, making us truly human? To be honest, not much. What we're left with is way more complicated, but also more interesting because now we know behavioral modernity is ancient, spread across different human species, and it comes and goes based on circumstances we're still trying to understand. Also, the gap between anatomical and behavioral modernity is partly an illusion created by preservation bias because some materials survive better in some places, search bias because we looked in some places way more than others, and cultural bias in how we interpreted evidence, making assumptions about what mattered based on prejudices about which populations were advanced. And what really gets to us from all these things is what else we're missing because of these biases. Because if we were this wrong about something as fundamental as when and where modern behavior emerged, if we missed or dismissed massive evidence for so long because it didn't fit the narrative we wanted, what else are we getting wrong now? How much of human prehistory is buried in places nobody's looked carefully enough or taken seriously enough? There could have been entire periods where culture was flourishing in amazing ways, but no archaeological signature was left, which means the story we tell will always be incomplete and biased toward whoever's doing the digging and deciding what's worth looking for. So as far as we know, human origins is still being written. The more we uncover, the more we find out how much we don't know. Maybe, just maybe, that should make us more humble about the stories we tell about where we came from, and more willing to question whose interests are served by keeping those stories unchanged.